From the age of 22 to 27 years old, I lived in a small home by myself in Arkansas. I had neighbors on both sides of me, but for the most part, we all kept to ourselves. We only interacted in passing and never really tried to spend time with one another. I didn't mind this because I tended to work long shifts at the shipping warehouse down the road from my house, so I didn't have much time to socialize anyway. The time I did have off, I typically spent it at home, whether it be inside watching TV and relaxing, or on a nice day, I enjoyed sitting out in my small yard and listening to some music under the sun. One thing I noticed about the neighbor that I had to the right of my house was that I rarely saw anyone other than him coming and going. So on the few occasions that he did have company, it was pretty surprising. I'll never forget the night that I realized something might not have been right about my neighbor. You see, I had finally gotten the day off, and I decided to mow the lawn before spending the rest of the day inside, and I happened to see my neighbor pull into his driveway, and to my surprise, he had a woman with him. Again, we weren't involved in one another's lives at all, so I didn't introduce myself or anything. I just waved and kept focusing on my yard before going inside my house as I originally planned. That night, as I was getting ready to lay down, I heard what sounded to me like a loud banging noise that seemed to be coming from my neighbor's house. I tried to ignore it, but grew more concerned when about a moment after hearing that loud sound, I heard what was unmistakably someone screaming. I quickly ran over to my window and looked down toward my neighbor's home, but I didn't see anything. After a few moments of listening to see if I heard any other strange noises or yelling, I thought hard about what I heard, and I felt compelled to call someone. I didn't want to jump the gun and cause any issues, but something didn't sit well with me about the situation, so I ended up calling the local police station and letting them know that there might have been a disturbance at my neighbor's house. However, when the police showed up and knocked on his door, he let them inside to search his house, but they came out a few moments later and left as if there was nothing wrong. At the time, I felt awful about the judgment I had made. Thankfully, we never talked about what happened. So after that night, we lived next to each other for another couple of months before I ended up moving into a different home that was still in the same area, just on the other side of town. I honestly never expected to see or hear anything about my neighbor ever again, but you can imagine my shock when I saw his name in the headlines 2 years later. He had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of homicide. The full story is unclear, but according to the people in town that knew him, he was arrested after getting another noise complaint similar to the call that I had placed. Only this time, he had been unable to hide the body or clean up his mess. After a thorough search of his home, it's rumored that police found the remains of 3 different women buried in the corner of an unfinished basement that he had on his property. A news segment about him also mentioned that they found multiple Tupperware in his refrigerator that contained human remains. I was living at home with my mom, dad, and kid sister Sarah, and for the most part, it felt like we lived in a safe neighborhood growing up. We never heard of anyone breaking into anyone's home or stealing from them. People didn't often get into fights in our town, and for the most part, people were very respectful of one another. That being said, one of the scariest incidents of my childhood happened in that house. You see, it was shortly after we had gotten a pair of new neighbors. It was a married couple that at the time seemed old, but that was likely because of how young I was. In reality, they were probably only in their 30s, and when they moved in, I remember wondering what they were like and if they had any kids for me and Sarah to play with. Sadly, they didn't, but at least they seemed like nice people. They introduced themselves to my mom and dad and let us know If we ever needed anything, we could always knock. But other than that, we didn't see much of them. That was until one night. I woke up in my room to the sound of the shed door swinging open. I got out of bed to see if it woke up my dad, and to my surprise, he was still asleep. Now I assumed that the wind had blown the shed door open. The latch wasn't too great, and it would slip open from time to time. So I decided to throw my shoes on and run outside to close the shed. No big deal, or so I thought. I ran out of my house, and as I got closer to the shed, I could hear the sound of someone inside. They were talking to themselves as they moved things around. I tried to get a better look at them, but I was too scared. Instead, I ran back inside and woke my dad up and told him that someone was breaking into our shed. He shot out of bed and ran to the door. I don't even remember him putting his shoes on before throwing the door open and running into the yard. I could hear him yelling outside, but his yelling quickly turned to silence, which was followed by the sound of 2 gunshots. I ran to the window and looked out into the yard. I could hardly see anything. All I could make out was the outline of a single person running away from my house and out of my yard. There was another person who seemed to be laying on the ground. That was my father. The man shot him twice in the chest. My mom called an ambulance, and he was promptly taken to the hospital. His condition was unclear for a while. However, he ended up pulling through. We were all shocked to hear him tell us who shot him. When he finally woke up and could talk, he reported to the police that it was our new neighbor. He had been rummaging through the shed, and when my father approached him, he pulled out a gun and fired 2 shots at him. The police picked him up in the home next to ours and found the gun that they believed he used to shoot my father, hidden underneath the kitchen sink. When I was 14 years old, my sister was 12, and I'll never forget when a man named Clay came to our door. Clay was 43 years old at the time, and he had just moved into our neighborhood when he knocked on our door. I happened to be the one who answered. He asked me if my parents were home, and I informed him that they were not, and he told me he would stop by again later when they were. I didn't think anything of it, and as soon as my mom got home, I told her about the man. She was confused because she hadn't been expecting anyone to stop by, and neither was my father. But when he didn't come by again, they both just chalked it up to being a salesman or something. Now, had they looked into it, they would have easily discovered that this was far from the case. We'll get to that. A few nights later, I was laying in my bed, getting ready to sleep so I could be up in time for school the next day, when I heard my sister screaming from her room, which was across the hall from mine. I shot out of bed and ran across the hall to see what was wrong. When I opened the door, she was just staring at the window with a look of terror in her eyes. She claimed that someone had been looking in the window at her. I ran across the room and pressed my face to the glass so I could look outside, but I didn't see anything. She was clearly shaken up though, so I asked her if she wanted to spend the night in my room. We could watch TV until we fell asleep. She loved the idea, and it wasn't that big of a deal. I wasn't too tired anyways. This is probably a good thing, because a short while after going into my room, my sister had fallen asleep, and I was still watching TV when I heard a noise coming from her room across the hall. I was confused, so I muted the TV and listened a bit closer. That's when I was certain the noise I was hearing was something or someone coming through her bedroom window. I could hear the creaking of their weight on the windowsill. I froze and looked at my sister to make sure she was still asleep. That's when I heard my mom scream and my dad yell. They must have heard the noise as well because they were at my sister's door in time to see Clay, the man who had come to our door earlier that week, trying to climb back out of my sister's room after realizing she wasn't in there anymore. We called the police, and it turns out that Clay was a registered sex offender who was at my house before to let us know that he had just moved in. But when my parents weren't home, he saw it as an opportunity to have an unsuspecting victim next door. As far as we know, he is still in prison for breaking and entering.